So in this tutorial, I wanted to cover my current setup for oil paints, my current palette setup for oil paints, and how I transfer them from one palette to the next, and how I also use clove oil to help preserve the paints to make them last a little bit longer. So the key to this system is, number one, having an airtight container that your palette fits in. And then number two is actually creating two palettes that are the same size that fit in. So, and the other thing I've done as well, inside this container, I've put a little ribbon so that I can easily pull out my palette when I'm using. Now, these are the new palettes that I've made using our split primary palette, so our normal colours. These are the ones you see me in the most recent videos. A couple of extra colours there that I've mixed earlier. And again, these are my normal split primary palette. So when I've finished painting for the day, this area is usually very messy, and I always like to start the day with a clean palette. So what I do, again, using this airtight system, I transfer everything ready so I'm good to go the next day. So I will simply take all the paints. Imagine this palette is dirty, and I will simply take all of the paints off here straight on to the new palette. So this is what I do at the end of a painting session. This is for oil paints. Once I've got my paints transferred over, and actually this one's nearly 2 weeks old and it's still very workable. So this system using the clove oil really does work, and it does make the paints last a little bit longer, maybe up to 2 weeks. Now I paint regularly, so that's plenty for me just to keep topping up what I need and just keep transferring the paints day to day with as minimum wastage as possible. Now, one or two paints, the earth tones particularly, the burnt sienna and the raw umber, do tend to dry a little bit quicker, but you can always add a couple of drops of oil to help slow that down. A couple of drops of, say, linseed oil or walnut oil, mix them in, which is actually what I've done with this one, because this is also quite a fast drying paint. But I've mixed a couple of drops of oil into it and then added it to the palette. And this is now almost 2 weeks old, and it's still lovely and creamy and able to use. So when I've transferred my paint, I will put them into this palette. I do suggest you put a little ribbon on. Now this is an A3 palette, but the A3 sheets don't fit perfectly. So I did have to get Gary to cut this down for me to fit perfectly into the large Masterson's airtight container with the blue lid. So these do fit, but you will have to sort of manipulate your palettes a little bit or find an alternative container. It really doesn't have to be a Masterson's one. It just has to be an airtight container. So, and again, I do advise you put a little ribbon on there because it really helps you lift up that palette. So the key now, they will stay longer in an airtight container anyway, but adding the clove oil really makes a difference. And what I like to do is I have a container with some cotton ball in there. I put a little Velcro, and that will go on the palette, and when I turn the lid over, that's facing down. Now I did try a few different methods, but of course the cotton balls just fall out if you're not careful. So what I've actually done is I've taken my container. You need to make sure it fits inside your palette. I've taken the container, and obviously be careful when you're using a knife, and I've gently cut around this and then pushed that out. So now as I close that, I know that the cotton balls aren't going to fall out. I've got the Velcro on there ready. I want to take a cotton ball. Now I hardly ever replace this. You will find that they go black and dark over time. Just keep topping the oil up, it'll be fine, the clove oil. It'll be fine. So I will pop that in there, and then I'm taking the clove oil out. And I'm going to soak this cotton ball with this. Every couple of weeks or so, I'll just keep adding a couple of extra drops. Once you've got the initial soaking, you're really just topping up that oil, so it will last. Keep turning that over. I want this completely soaked. Now, I don't mind the smell, but of course, if you do, this might not be a perfect option for you. And I do think you need to be careful around animals. I don't have animals coming into my studio, or at least anywhere near this. And initially setting up is a bit smelly. I don't actually mind the smell. I think it's quite pleasant. The initial setup is quite smelly, but once I actually use the system, I only ever take the lid off, take the palette, and then put the lid back on. So you really get very minimal smells in your studio. So I have to completely soak that now. I want to make sure you want to press it. You want a little bit of that fluid to be coming to the surface. That's how you know it's going to be thoroughly soaked. And then obviously now, if I turn that upside down, that'll just fall out. But having that little hole in the lid just allows me to close that. I can then fasten that onto here. And I like to use two because, you know, I'm a more is more girl. And the way this works is it will stop the paint from oxidizing or slow it completely down. So that way then your oil paints will last longer. Now when I'm mixing a particular batch of colour, these are just tube colours, so I'm okay to transfer these from tray to tray and not worry, because I know that each time I lay out the paints they're always going to be standard. But if I was mixing, say, a batch of 4 skin tones, then I actually would freeze these between sessions whilst I was working on a particular painting. So for example, I would just use one of these ceramic containers, pop my skin colours on there. They then go in a little plastic container, and I also put the lid on, and that I get a little label, and I will write the portrait name on there or the dog name if I'm working on a commission. I don't totally rely on the paint lasting with this system. When I've mixed skin colours or a pet portrait and I want the paint to last, I will actually freeze individual specific to that particular portrait or person. But using this method, the paint does last a couple of weeks, a little bit longer than if I didn't have anything at all. So I find this quite helpful. And then again, because I've put those onto the lid, I'm not worried about that falling off. They're velcroed on there. And then I will simply turn that lid over. I like to get the corners on first. And then make sure it's fully sealed. And then simply I put a little pressure on the centre and make sure all the air is completely out. So this simply goes in my cupboard. Again, it reduces, there's not very much smell. And when I'm ready to use the palette again in the morning, I simply take that off. Take my palette out. Pop my lid back on, and again that contains all the smell and things like that, and I'm ready to go the following day, and usually the paints have lasted again, and I just transfer them palette to palette with absolute minimal wastage. When it comes to topping up these, all I do is simply just maybe once a week I'll just add an extra drop of the clove oil in each of them, and then I know that that will last. So that's how I currently use and set up my oil paints, between this system and then freezing any particular paints for a particular painting or portrait, the paints are lasting, and I'm able to work on one particular painting for a couple of weeks without worrying about my colours all drying out. So I hope you found this tutorial helpful.